Mm-hmm. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm glad to see Eileen joining us this evening. So if you're joining us for the first time on YouTube, welcome. I do have our social comments up, so if you want to interact with us and let us know any questions, concerns, or thoughts, love to. We do have some handouts right there if you want to grab one in the class here. All right, looks like we got audio, we got everything going, so we'll get settled in here and get started. So we've been looking at some special topics, things that are kind of outside what I've ever taught when it comes to extra biblical topics that do affect our faith and the church. There's many things that we as Christians, and I know growing up, that I'm not going to say that my Bible teachers necessarily neglected, but I don't either recall it taught much or discussed much until I got to college and took some late and antiquity religion classes and things and started looking, and then through the years of preaching and studying, trying to find out the contextual situation of what the books are written, what's going on historically. It just added so much value. And it's not, when it comes to some of those, like we looked at the intertestament period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that period they call the silence. And some of these topics, they don't have anything really to do with our salvation. And I'm not claiming that any of this is going to change and should not ever change anything that we know that we're getting from the New Testament. And so I'm not trying to reshape anything. This is just strictly from a secular class, in other words, from the way that the world views the history of the Christians in the first century, and looking at the way that Rome and the culture of Rome, the Roman Empire, looking on Jews and Christians, and that's what those previous classes were doing, was looking at why did they persecute Christians and the relationship that the Jews had with the Romans historically. And so I think that it again helps us that when we come back and we're studying our Bible and we're reading through the letters of Paul, that it really helps to add that value to understanding the culture. And it is exciting, to me at least anyway, to have that knowledge. So tonight we're going to talk about Apostolic Fathers. And so let's talk about that word alone, because I know some Christians may not even have heard it, or if they've heard it, never fully been able to define exactly what it meant. The Apostolic Fathers, and the word apostolic, the apostles. So the word is the root of apostles, and the Apostolic Fathers, and the ones that come after the apostles. And in that, there's a range of those that are writers and known historically that were living beyond after all the apostles and overlap. So there's actually even a subclass considered the sub-apostolic fathers, and that means they're the ones that were the closest to the actual apostles. So they either lived with them, or they knew apostles, or they were the students of somebody who lived with an apostle. So what we have is, you think about the apostles themselves, well, they were inspired directly by Jesus. They had to have lived with him from the baptism all the way through death, burial, resurrection, seen him in the resurrection. That qualified him as an apostle. So when we talk about the Apostolic Fathers, these are men who then had to have known the apostles, were taught by the apostles, discipled by the apostles, or they were a disciple of the apostle. So, for example, Polycarp, the men who then lived under the timeline of Polycarp, who we know historically was a disciple of John. So we can have the connection and the assurance in saying, well, if Polycarp was somebody who was a disciple of the apostle, then he probably has it right. What he has learned from the apostle and the way that he is teaching the Christians after the apostle John was gone. And then the disciples that he had were men who were probably taught correctly by Polycarp. Now, these are assumptions, but those men underneath Polycarp are probably pretty sound in the teachings that Polycarp received from John, who then, where did John receive his? Well, from the Holy Spirit. So it is a transition. What we find is that during these apostolic fathers are men who are outside the lifespan of those men that we know assuredly were guided by the Holy Spirit. So they lived within the first and early second centuries. So some of them were born as, 35 AD, about the time that Jesus was crucified. And then they lived up into 105 AD, 110 AD. So there's some of those overlap. We have some that were born toward the end of like 100 AD that lived on into like 170 AD. So we have a range of men who were living during that time that was very influential. And that's what is kind of important, because we talk about the time of silence with the New Testament. And we go, well, what happened? I mean, we go from the Old Testament temple worship and all the culture of that last verse in Malachi, all of a sudden we open up in Matthew and we've got Sadducees, Pharisees, synagogues, we got the Romans, we have all these things going on. And we kind of go, well, what happened? What was going on in between there that got us to those conditions? So we kind of have that in a way, if you think about it, as Christians, after John died, the beloved John, that we believe was the last apostle to live, to today, what happened? Right? How did we get here? Where did we come from? Now, if you're a member of a denomination, you probably go, well, we started our church at this date, and we started this church at this date, and Church of Christ, what do we always say? We always say 33 AD, or when Jesus was crucified, because that's what we believe. We say, well, that's when the church that was established by Christ was started. And we can look at inspired New Testament writings and say, this is what was taught. But after the letters of John, we've got how many thousand years now in between? Now, and that's why I'm saying, okay, we don't need to necessarily know. We don't when it comes to our salvation. And we've done fine without knowing it. And if you missed the class tonight, it's not going to impact your salvation. And when you get to heaven, there's no quiz on the Apostolic Fathers. Nobody at the gate of heaven is going to sit and go, okay, Ron, who is Polycarp? Or any of those. No, it's not. But I hope what you'll see is the impact that they have had on the Christian faith. And I'm saying that very broadly. How did it shape the direction that the church went as soon as the apostles were gone? And we start to see that many things that start to hit the church and change it a lot. And so that's what we want to look at. So that's what we're going to do, is look at those. A few of them tonight, we'll look at those, because I think it is important to understand a few of the men that are the most important. And historically, there are others. I don't want to dive in, and we could spend one class each Wednesday just going over one of them, each one of them. And I don't think that's is necessary. So you're going to get the Cliff Notes kind of that. And understand, I hope to see the difference between, what happened, bridging us between what we know is inspired and we can confidently trust it in the New Testament to now, what is the church teaching later? And, see the impact and some of the things, the challenges that they have. And some of those source writings are from Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, and the Didache, which very few people even know what that document is. And then we're going to talk at the last, we'll talk about that document, because it's an important historical document. Whether we like it or not, whether you read it or not, I suggest you go read it. It's available online. We'll talk about the outline and we'll go into some more on that. But it's interesting. I think it's important, again, how were those Christians living and teaching, and what did they know and act and worship after the apostles were gone? I mean, where did it go? I mean, we jump to the Catholic Church and we go, okay, well, there we go, But how do we go from there? And then there's hundreds of years and such. So, but we're going to narrow it. We're going to look at that little bridge right after the apostles. And you're going to start to see, even in some of these apostolic ones, Apostolic Fathers, there's some things they're starting to say that I think were taken possibly out of context, or we don't know the true intent of what they were saying, but I can imagine that there were some that were reading, so like Clement I, that's a very important historical letter written by Clement of Rome. And I can see where people would take that and they could do what they want with it and change it around. So it's not comfortable. I'll tell you from like my own experience, when you start to read their writings in the Didache, when we read that, it's not comfortable. Because there's some things that you read they're saying and such that you're going, that's not the way I was raised. That's not really what I was taught. That's why I'm hammering this point. These are not inspired men. Not all of them, I should say. Let me qualify that. And I have that in my outline. They're not all inspired. And so we cannot take them and their writings and say, well, we need to modify now our faith. We need to change the way we worship. We need to change. No, don't. Because we absolutely, without a doubt, know the New Testament's solid. I mean, those letters that we have provide us what we need. Like Paul told the Galatians, you've received what you need to know. The faith, as Jude said, has been once delivered and once and for all. So it's not something that we've been missing out on, because there are some that have, and we want to look at some of later on, one of the Wednesday night classes, I want to look at some of those books that were discovered in the 50s that were dug up in Egypt and how they've created a stir in the church. And that's what I mean. I'm not trying to do that as well. It's like I'm revealing something to you that we should have modified years ago, but we haven't because of our hard traditions. No, the New Testament is what we need to have, and that's where we need to stay. And if there's something that contradicts the New Testament and one of these Apostolic Fathers say, then the Apostolic Father, as far as I'm concerned, is wrong. Just because they're classified. Because one of the things that you'll see when you go and look up the Apostolic Fathers, the Catholic Church has sainted them all. So it's Saint Polycarp, Saint Ignatius, Saint. And so when you put that extra title on, now they didn't go around calling themselves that. There's no letter that any of these men ever, are addressed to Saint Polycarp, that Clement wrote to Polycarp and called, no. It's something that happened hundreds of years later. And so just because it has it doesn't mean that these men are all of a sudden super important when it comes to us needing to listen and follow what they're saying. We have to then rely on just those letters. So I hope I hit that pretty hard. So that's why when we talk about why, because it connects us to those earlier generations, and it's important to see that. And to see how Christians interpreted and lived the gospel. There are some things that I also want to say when it comes to this that is very cultural. That, as Paul would say, we have no custom for this. For example, remember in Corinthians when they're talking about head coverings and the controversy about head coverings. And at the end of it, he goes, and as far as the Church of Christ, we have none. And remember as well, Paul very powerfully through in Colossians and the other letters saying, about days and weeks and meat and all this. No, we don't have those. So there are things that this church we're looking at, these men are coming out of a church that is very Jewish oriented in its culture. And it started out as a very Jewish Christian church because all of the initial Christians were what? They were Jews. So they held on to some things that were not sinful as long as they didn't force them on others, like circumcision, If there was a Jewish Christian that said, I'm still going to circumcise my children, that's fine. But don't teach that you have to circumcise. So there are cultural things that they continue to have that influence even into the early centuries after the apostles. And that's something as well. So our culture today, for example, we've been commanded to greet with a holy kiss. You forgot to give me one when you walked in. Where's my holy kiss? So why aren't we doing that? You see, why aren't we doing something? So that's why I want to put it into perspective that if you do go and you read some of these things, they are around the culture in which these people lived. It didn't make it scriptural so when you read that they're doing something that's a little different, think about the cultural reason they're doing these things. And is it violating the scripture? If it is, then they shouldn't have been doing it. But just because they're doing it doesn't mean that it's scriptural. Do you understand? Or am I confusing it? Because that is something you need to think about as we go through. So when you hear me say something, or we're reading something from one of them this evening, and all of a sudden you go, whoa, Irenaeus said this, so think about the cultural. And think about, is it something that is contradicting the New Testament? And so we can look also and learn how they modeled their faith under pressure. I've got some martyrs that we're going to look at, a couple of the Apostolic Fathers, that it just blows my mind. It just causes me to really shrink back. I saw a comedian, and he's a Christian comedian, and he said, did your parents ever tell you that when you get to heaven that you're going to have to talk to Noah, Samson, and all them? And what are you going to say? Samson's going to, Noah's going to say, I built a boat. Took me 100 years to build. And you're sitting there going, I cut a block of wood. Samson's going to say, I tore a lion apart. And you're going, I'm allergic to cats. You think about sometimes, what they've accomplished. And so that's what I mean about when I read about these men and what they did and these Christians and their faith, man, I feel like that. I feel like, man, and I cower at what? What am I cowering about? Why? So we can look at the way that they handled the pressures, because we looked at the persecutions last week and what they went through. So I think that's another reason looking at that. We can also see one of the things that you see as well is the power of the scripture in their lives every day. That's something that it really did help to shape. And one of the other things that we see is how that these Apostolic Fathers really taught hard about unity, humility, and holiness. And it's very powerful when we see that. And that's not any different than what we read in the New Testament as well, from the scriptures of the New Testament. I think also, as we look at it and we see that, we put it into that perspective culturally. It also, as you go further into these Apostolic Fathers, further away from them, there's some of them that start teaching some things and shaping the church that I feel are not right. So to me, that's those guardrails. When we look at them and seeing that we need to also use that as an example that, wait a minute, we need to have some guardrails. Today in our culture and my upraising, I know many men that were very faithful, that taught many wonderful things, and then years later they were considered a heretic because they started teaching something bizarre. But they wrote a book, on the minor prophets, and then all of a sudden later on they come out and they start teaching something that's just so foreign to the scripture, and you're going, what? So that's what I mean about the guardrails. We have to use a lot of caution when we look at this. So let's go to Clement of Rome. He is probably a contemporary of the apostles, and he's also considered a leader in the Church of Rome. There's a couple of historians, Irenaeus and Tertullian, historians believe and say he was an apostle, a disciple of both Paul and Peter. And it's possible, there's no real historical support to show that he is the one Clement that Paul is talking about in Philippians 4:3, when he says, with Clement and also the rest of my fellow workers. It's very possible that his lifespan did cover that, but we can't with absolute certainty say, yep, that's the guy. But there are some, even the first century, that were saying, yeah, this is the guy. This is Clement. He was in Rome, traveled to Rome, and in Rome, and was considered a leader, an elder, a bishop in Rome around 96 AD. Now put that into perspective when we look at John. You know, John's martyrdom occurred between 96 to 100 something, the apostle. And so we can see where, Peter was martyred much later. They were all martyred basically, except John dying, before 70 AD. So if we look at we don't have the birth date of Clement, but based on his writings and such, he absolutely overlapped the lives of Peter and Paul. So, he was instrumental in the letter that he wrote to the church at Corinth from Rome, which that's one of the interesting things, is that his style that he wrote this letter, First Clement, it's what it's called. And again, these are public domain. You can go and read this letter as well. It's very interesting because he has a Paulistic style. He is writing to Corinth, and he's dealing with some problems very similar to what Paul did in Corinth. There's some things that are happening, and so Clement is writing to them and trying to help them through that. So, in his relationship, because of Paul, and maybe even the church itself, why he is doing this. And so the thing that I see within this letter is his stress of order and the authority of the local elders and the way that they need to submit to them. Now, the other thing is to understand that the church, when we say the church in Corinth, not all, when we see these letters like Galatia and Ephesus, that they all met in one congregation. It is very similar to like larger cities where you would have multiple church homes. But then these dealings were a lot of times they would just address a city. So it would be like, what Jesus wrote to the church of Las Cruces. He'd be talking to the faithful of those in Las Cruces, but we know there are multiple congregations within this area. Because a lot of times, because of the persecution, they just couldn't go and rent a building. They didn't build church buildings, and sometimes they were so large that they would have to meet in multiple locations at one time. And so this unity is unity in the body of those Christians, and also the idea of the authority of those elders that have been placed over them, and that's holding on to that. And we see in that letter as well how much he refers to the Scripture and the Old Testament and quotes it. I mean, he's very accurate in most of what he is saying. So that's something that I thought was powerful about Clement of Rome. Like I said, I'm giving you the Cliff Notes. There's a lot of other things that we could look at as far as that. Ignatius of Antioch is probably the most influential. His time period between 35 AD to 110. There is some, I guess you'd say, kind of some teachings that were going around, kind of myths or such, about the fact that he was this little boy that was sitting on Jesus' knee. No. Now, this was the first century people that were around that time. And, oh, yeah, he was that little boy that was on Jesus' knee. There's absolutely no factual way to back that up. So you can see that. He was also an elder in Antioch. This is Antioch of Syria, which was a fundamental church that Paul himself came through and established and based a lot of his mission work out of there. He is also likely a disciple of John and closely influenced by his teachings. He was eventually arrested and taken under Roman guard to Rome. Now, if you'll recall, when we talked about the persecutions, one of the things that the Roman emperors were dealing with was this new conflict that was coming out because of this division within Judaism. And it was these Christians. And the idea of how do you handle them? Because, remember the Romans were polytheists, so they believed in multiple gods. And all these gods, you need to please them, because if you didn't, you could risk some sort of catastrophic event striking the empire and causing it to go through some catastrophic damage. So in a sense, it was kind of, I call it homeland security. If you had somebody that was offending the god of the sea or the ocean or the fertility, you could actually impact the welfare of the Roman Empire. So that was a threat. So they were trying to deal with this conflict that was arising, and Pliny wrote a letter to Trajan, the emperor. And in that letter, he's asking him, what do we do? What do we do with these guys? And Trajan came out and said, look, he gave him a process. And that process was, if you have two witnesses, you have two people, then you bring them forward. You bring that person that's been accused of being an atheist, because they looked at Christians as atheists, and give them an opportunity to offer a sacrifice to the gods. And if they don't, then execute them. So Ignatius is one of these that gets rounded up, and is a group of them are then transported back to Rome. And on his way back to Rome, he writes 7 letters as he's going to Rome. And he, very similar to like the journey that Paul took that we read in Acts, except he didn't go by way of ocean. They went through Asia Minor and across Greece and then into Rome. And it took, a month or so, or however long it took him to travel. And during that time, he wrote these letters, and he met with them and different Christians. And these letters are pretty famous to the different churches. There's like 7 churches that he wrote to, and then one personal letter that he wrote to Polycarp himself, and apparently met with him as well. So, again, his themes, it's interesting, very similar. Unity and the body, the church, structure, and the idea of the gospel about Christ, because some of the things that were starting to happen were these heresies, these false teachings that were creeping in. The very, very first one that the apostles were starting to deal with, if you can think about it as a heresy, was the idea of circumcision. Teaching that you had to circumcise along with your faith in the gospel. That would be classified as a heresy. So there were a lot of other heresies, and we're going to look at those next week and just go through some of those heresies, those teachings, because those roots go all the way back that we're battling today. Some of the heresies, they go back to the heresies that the first century Christians were dealing with. So, Ignatius is one that wrote a lot against the heresies as well. So we see in his key things that you extract if you're looking at his letters is this idea of faithfulness and persecution. Now remember, he writes these letters on his way to his death. He's already been condemned to die. He's going to go to Rome to die in the Colosseum. And he already knows that it's probably going to be by lions, that he's going to be torn apart. And his view of martyrdom is what he is amazing, talking about the faith and how far are you willing to go for your faith. And this is something that was so extraordinary is about his faith. The letter Romans 4 that he wrote, this is a quote kind of coming from him, is, "Let me be the food for the wild beasts. I am God's wheat." And he looked at it as, I am going to do the Lord's work. I'm going to hold on. I'm going to remain faithful all the way through. On this journey, there were actually a plot to free him by Christians, to get him out so he wouldn't become a martyr. And he says, no, let God's will be done. Now he wasn't suicidal. He wasn't, saying, I have to die like Christ in order to be righteous. He just knew that, in a sense, it was a part of this persecution, the way that they had treated Christ, and holding on to his faith was going to have this much greater impact that it eventually did. The martyr's blood really caused the Roman Empire to crumble in this view towards Christianity. In 311, when Constantine comes along, you see that it finally caused it in men like Ignatius. I think of him as well when I think in Revelation about the martyrs under the throne. The description of crying out, how long? Some of those martyrs and Ignatius as being one of those. And so his, again, unity and church leadership. And now if you think about, they're battling a lot of heresies. Who was the first church's guidance and who were keeping them under control? It was apostolic. The apostles, those letters that Paul wrote, that's what he was doing, was basically keeping them on the right path and helping to keep them under that. And so this is a thing that you see these apostolic men trying to do as well, is keeping the church focused, that unity of body of the church and the leadership and a respect for that, those elders that were in place under them. And so respecting those elders and urging them to just keep holding on. Because a lot of times that's how, churches fall apart, is through persecution, through lack of respect for the leaders, or no leadership at all as well. So the other thing that we talked about, the heresies, that where Ignatius starts to write a lot, and I say he is one of the first Apostolic Fathers that writes so much about the heresies. So therefore, he is a lot of his writings is around the nature of Christ. There was a lot of questions and stuff, and so he was very firm about the idea that he was both human and that Jesus was God, countering a lot of those heresies that we're going to talk about next week that seemed to try to claim that he was either a human or he couldn't be human. He was some form of a spiritual heavenly being that looked like a human. And, Ignatius in his writings, he's just really ripping them about that, which, I get kind of crazy about that as well. And so he's urging these believers to hold fast to the teachings of the apostles. Isn't that an interesting thing? Isn't that what we try to do? We try to hold fast, and that's what we say. And how do we do that? We do that through their letters. We do that through the New Testament, holding fast to those teachings. So that's why I say, even though, we're looking at these men, don't look at these men as somehow they're greater than the apostles. They themselves are telling people, and those Christians, go back, stay focused on what was written and provided to us already, and keeping that rooted in Christ. Now, Polycarp is probably the most well-known. I think he's the first one that I kind of ever remember, that I could remember his name most frequently, was Polycarp of Smyrna, which is in the Turkey, Asia Minor area, and his martyrdom. He is probably had the most emotional impact. Now, he was martyred after Ignatius. Remember when Ignatius was traveling to be martyred, he wrote to Polycarp. Polycarp, when he was martyred, he was much older. He was in his late 70s, and people in the area there had a lot of respect for him. But because of agitation and accusations, they finally came and they brought him forward. And he went into apparently like the Colosseum or a public area, and this debate ensues about faithfulness and them yelling at him, calling him an atheist, and him standing there boldly looking around and saying, "They're the atheists." He's pointing to all of them. And he keeps going back and forth with them. And then all of a sudden, finally, he says, just let it be done. Do what you're going to do. And so they're going to burn him. And so they go ahead and they go to tie him up. And he says, no, don't. Don't tie me up. And so they set him on fire and burn him So there's a lot of myths as well that come out of some of these martyrs, that some say he wasn't burning, that a soldier had to go up and then spear him, but the fact that he was burnt alive was the way that he met his death as well. So one of the famous letters that he had wrote was to the Philippians, on faithfulness and righteousness. And I think it's one of the most impactful. Him and Ignatius were some of the very first, outside of the New Testament martyrs, like Stephen and others, that really started to have an impact on the citizens of the areas that they were at. Remember, Polycarp and Ignatius and these men were also very good citizens in their cities and communities where they were living. So when the government would come in and attack these really good men, it really disturbed a lot of their friends that weren't Christians, and actually created a lot more Christians, because they would see this beautiful person of Polycarp and Ignatius and things, and they go, the government's wrong. And it would cause people to actually respond more positively to the gospel because of their martyrdom. So I think, his moral courage and faithful endurance is one of the big ones. So let's talk about this document, the Didache. First off, it's considered one of the very first church, like I said, I'm going to say some things you won't be comfortable with, church manuals that was passed around. Because if you think about the churches, they were guided by letters that were written and sent to different locations and then copied, and then those letters would then be forwarded out. There was no Bible. They were just letters. And so their worship, as it was documented by Pithney and others, they would read these letters on Sundays when they would worship. So if they had the Corinthian letters, they had the Philippian letters, they had Mark, the Gospels, or whatever letters, they would read those letters. Even as far away as Carthage in northern Africa, there were churches there and they had letters. And so they started passing these letters and sharing them and trying to get letters. So that was what they were reading and focusing on. Now think about how much detail does that give us if we look at it specifically on precisely how do you worship? How do you baptize? How do you do certain very fundamental things? How do you prepare the Lord's Supper? What container do you? I've heard some of these questions even come around in our lifetime where, some of the things that we do. Can we have multiple cups? Can we have one cup? Do we use plastic cups? Can we do this? When do you do it? Do you do it in the morning? The latest one within my lifetime and ours is, can you even do it twice on Sunday? Right? So imagine these new Christian churches that were focusing on the letters. They're focusing on the apostolic teachers, the letters that they're receiving in the gospel. But so there were some questions, about what do you do with new converts, certain actions. And so the other thing is this document was never discovered until like 1800s. So that's another reason. It's very similar like the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. It wasn't found for centuries later. And like I say this about the Gnostic Gospels and all these other exterior books that are popping up all over, if they were that important, God would have had it in our Bible that we have today. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if God would have wanted us to have them, we would have had them. And I understand there are some of them I believe are credible historical books, okay? I'm not going to say that they're atrocious per se, but it doesn't mean that they reflect the doctrine of Christ and what God has wanted us to have. And I get real cynical, and I may say it very silly, but to say that somehow that man was able to hide a book from us today means to me, there's no God. Because either God was able to be more powerful and wiser than a man, and making sure that his book was assembled. The committee that canonized, which canon means recognized as authentic, and the process they went through, there's nothing about that that's necessarily inspirational by an apostle's hand. But I can see God all over that, because, the criteria, if you go, and you can, again, these are documents historical, you can go and look at the process of the books that were selected and how they went through and selected them. Now, whether these are faithful men or not, I don't know. But you can look at that secular process and say, wow, they use a lot of due diligence to make sure that the ones that they included were correct and we could accept them. And that's why I'm saying that when these men were doing this and the canonization process of all these letters and bringing together the New Testament, I'm sure that the Gnostic Gospel of John would have popped up and made it over there. And then it would have been screened by the criteria in which the council had set and either accepted or rejected. The other thing is, a lot of those add nothing to what we already have. They don't. And I've got a book in the back of the Gnostic Gospels, and I'm telling you, they are so bizarre. They do not sound at all like the Gospels we have. So to me, when I read them, it just blows my mind, some of the stuff that they're saying and the way they write it. Every one of the letters that you write, and somebody said, well, it's because that's what you've always read, so you're more comfortable. Maybe so. But you can tell some of them are absolutely trying to appear like they're Paul, writing like Paul, and they're not. And they sound silly to me. And so, but again, if God thought they were that important, yeah, absolutely, you're right. They would have been included. And that's the way I feel about this Didache document. And Didache means teaching. That's all it means. So it's a cool word that just basically means it's kind of like the church's teachings to explain things and some of those things. So, and they say they base it on the teaching of the apostles. So, and we have no idea who the writers are. There's no person, one singular. Most believe, based on the way that it's compiled, that there were multiple, maybe even some of these Apostolic Fathers had a hand in adding some wisdom or their input on this. But it was absolutely something that throughout the Mediterranean, all the way Syria, Africa, Northern Africa, everything, this document was translated into multiple languages. So this was a widespread document. It's not like one little area. So it did play a major role in the church. And it's really one of the oldest teachings on what we'd call Christian living. And between 90 to 120 AD is when this was put together. Again, think about how soon that was after the apostles were gone. So it was kind of to help out, to say, okay, this is kind of where you go through the baptism. This is how the Lord's Supper and things like that. And so some of those topics, like I just mentioned, everything from baptism, the Lord's Supper, church leadership, things like this. And it reflects the New Testament ethic and structure. Culturally, though, there are some things that if you read it and you hear them say, you'd be very uncomfortable. You go, whoa, we would never, I don't know about that. And I'm not even going to bring them up because I know I'd get some people stirred up. But if you want to talk about it offline, I'll talk to you about it because, I've read it. And it made me uncomfortable reading it going, what? And again, just like you said, Lorenzo, if it was that important, it would have been passed to us today. And it's not. That's why I said what I said at the beginning of the church, at the beginning of this study, right? Just because it's something that's an ancient document and they were doing it, and even though it was so widespread, like this Didache is, doesn't mean that it's something we should be doing.
The church slowly started to drift away from
I don't have the mic on, so I'm going to repeat so people online can hear. And I should have done it for you, Lorenzo. Gary was saying that this document something that could also help to show, because we know the diversion of the church's history away from the original teachings and some weird stuff. That absolutely, my filter was right on top of that when I read it. And that's what causes me to have a lot of pause about it. And then when I start considering the cultural differences from, like, for example, I mean, if you go to the Philippines to a Church of Christ, you are going to be very uncomfortable. If you go to Juarez, right? If you've ever gone, even in town here, when I go over to the Spanish congregation, it's uncomfortable. They have cultural things. Are they doing anything unscriptural? No. But there's a few things, that I know growing up. When I went to Germany, there was a small little congregation over there. And it was like, ooh, and I'm like, calm down, settle down. There's some cultural things that were okay. But I agree. I think that is the thing that and that's when we look at some of those writings, you will see some words, like the word bishop, the one thing that, and because of the fact that they sainted all of these guys, automatically it seems as if then everything they wrote is all of a sudden magnified and almost trumps the New Testament. I'm like, whoa, no, that's how we got in trouble. That's how the church took off in the wrong direction. The guardrails were off. And so but I'm bringing up the Didache because I think it's important to understand, to see the struggle they had in understanding. It's like when I travel or go somewhere else, or maybe you go somewhere else, they might ask you, so, what songbook do you guys use, right? What Bible translation? Well, we over here, we do this. And I know there's been times where I've traveled and I saw something wonderful that a church somewhere else was doing, and it's like, wow, okay, cool. Come over here, and I come back home and go, hey guys, let's try this. It's like, yeah, and we do it. You go to Wyoming somewhere, and it's like, well, we don't do that. This is the way we do things here, But we still have the Lord's Supper. We still sing the same. You see, so that's the way the Didache, I think, is kind of that way. Even though it has some other things. Again, it's just an important document to bridge that gap that we've been talking about as we come through. And so I've already kind of discussed some of this. And even like it talks about some of the instruction for new converts before baptism, which again, one of the things I will bring up is that they were saying that you need to fast. The person being baptized should fast for so many days, and that the person that is doing the baptizing and all this, and if possible, even their family should fast. Well, we don't even fast. Not that it's right or wrong or something again, but think about the Jewish culture of the church, right? Being very Jewish in orientation and start out, it was something else that was. Now, is it wrong if you run across a group of people who say, well, we should fast? Well, to me, if a person is accepting they want to become a Christian, you do it. You don't say, well, we got to wait and fast. But again, that's what I mean about it makes us a little uncomfortable. But let's stick to our New Testament, right? And we can be sure of that. And that's why I talked about this earlier. The rediscovery in 1873, Greek manuscripts in Constantinople after being lost for centuries. So here's kind of the outline, and we're going to wrap up. 2 ways of life, which I thought was really cool, because it basically is establishing a synopsis. In other words, kind of a overall statement that basically there's 2 roads, right? There's the narrow and the wide way. There's the ways of life. There's the moral teaching you follow, and it's kind of almost goes back to Deuteronomy, where you have this choice in life. You follow after the moral life, you follow after God's ways, and you'll be blessed, and then there's the other. So there's a lot of the moral teaching about loving God, your neighbor, and following after, the commandments that we receive from the New Testament. 7 through 10 gets very specific in some of the actions that we just kind of talked about how to fast, praying, and Lord's Supper and such. And then 11 through 15 is like the church, talking about the organization. Also, what was fascinating is traveling preachers or teachers. They could only hang out a day or two, and then you had to send them on. They were not to stick around. And the reason was they didn't want them leeching off of you, and sticking around and getting that, because you also had other prophets and teachers. Prophets were playing a little different role, and that a little more detail. That's why I'm saying, it's kind of like, oh, so you can't pay a preacher. It's like, you have to understand what were the roles in the church then and what they were doing. The prophets were doing most of what we would consider the pulpit preaching, but these traveling teachers or traveling evangelists, in a sense, they had very specific instruction, which tells me that some of those guys would go to town and stay there and expect the church to just provide everything for them. So that gives you an insight. So that's one of the fascinating things about it. And then, of course, 16 is focusing on end times, because these are some heresies, false teachings about when Christ was coming. Right away, it was already happening. When is he going to come? He's coming tomorrow. He's going to be here. There were some groups saying a very specific place. Some Christians saying a very specific place in Turkey that he's coming back. And so you can see where there was some need to discuss the fact, warnings about the end times and Christ's return. Roles of the bishops, deacons, I already talked about that. So some of the things that we can look at, I think overall, is taking into consideration the Apostolic Fathers, is I think one of the big ones is the faithfulness during the persecution, the way they held on to their faith, and the way that they really helped to enforce the apostolic teachings, apostles themselves, and holding the structure of those local congregations. That's something as well, is the local autonomy and the local structures that were there. Like you said, Gary, we see this slow diversion away where you start to find an organization that starts to build that these first apostolic writers were not supporting. They weren't talking about it. So that is encouraging. But we saw how the churches, while Paul was living, were quickly doing what? We saw Jesus through John in Revelations writing to churches, talking about some things how bad they were starting to turn. So some lessons as well, the moral and living standard rooted in Christ and remaining steadfast. I think that's something in the apostolic teaching, the apostles, the letters, Peter, the letters that we have, what we have. We see that in these early apostolic fathers. All right, that's it. That's all I got. Any closing thoughts or comments? I do have some outlines here. If you weren't able to make it, you can make it down to the church building, let me know. If you want a copy of this, you can also email me or reach out through the comments. I'll share it with you. Again, I am not a historian. I am not a scholar. I'm not a perfect person when it comes to presenting maybe all these concepts. And I'm going to admit, I'm not going to say I got all my dates and everything just absolute. That's why I'm not teaching in great detail, just giving you kind of an overall view of this aspect of the Apostolic Fathers. So this Sunday morning, 9:45 for Bible study, 10:45 for worship, and then in the afternoon, 4 p.m. So until then, well, God bless.